Morning. So today I was planning to continue with my parabolic reading of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. And to define a parable expresses an abstract argument by means of using a concrete narrative for easy understanding. Parable expresses an abstract argument by means of using a concrete narrative to be easily understood. What does that mean for the Pied Piper of Hamelin? What does it mean that it is a parable? What is the abstract argument that it is making? As I've said in earlier episodes or streams, I'm making the argument that the poem, The Pied Piper of Hamelin, is a philosophical response to Plato's Republic. or well, let's say it's a poetic response to Plato's philosophical work, The Republic. Wherein he argues that artists are detrimental to society. I should say not all artists. I think he makes some concessions for certain types of art. I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to read. I've read The Republic, but it's been a long time since I've read it, so I'd have to reread it. Before I continue with my thesis, I'm going to recite the poem just to get my brain working. But I want you to keep in mind the definition of parable, which is, again, parable expresses an abstract argument by means of using a concrete narrative to be easily understood. So in the example of the Pied Piper, for instance, it is a concrete narrative where we need to discover the abstract argument that is being made in that poem. Anyways, here it goes. I'm going to recite the whole poem, well, most of the poem. I haven't memorized the entire thing yet, so I'm still working on it. But I know enough of the poem that I certainly have enough memorized to make an argument about the poem. Analyze the poem. Here it goes. Hamlin towns in Brunswick, by famous Hanover city, the river Weser deep and wide washes its wall on the southern side. A pleasanter spot you never spied, but when begins my ditty, almost 500 years ago. To see the townsfolk suffer so from vermin was a pity. Rats, they fought the dogs and killed the cats, and bit the babies in the cradles, and ate the cheeses from the vats, and licked the soup from the cook's own ladles, split open the kegs of salted sprats, made nests in the men's Sunday hats, and even spoiled the women's chats by drowning out their speaking with shrieking and squeaking in 50 different sharps and flats. At last, people in a body to the town hall came flocking. "'Tis clear," cried they, "our mayor is a naughty, and as for our corporation, shocking to think we buy gowns lined with ermine, for dolts who canter won't determine what's best to rid us of our vermin. You hope because you're old and obese to find in the furry civic robes ease. Rouse up, sirs, give your brains a racking to find the remedy we are lacking, or sure as fate will send you packing." At this the mayor and corporation quaked with a mighty consternation. An hour they sat in council. At length the mayor broke silence. "For a guilder I'd my ermine gown sell. I wish I were a mile hence. It's easy to bid one rack one's brain. I'm sure my poor head aches again. I scratch it so, but all in vain. Oh, for a trap, a trap, a trap. Just as he said this, what should hap? At the chamber door, but a gentle tap. Bless us, cried the mayor, what's that? With the corporation as he sat, looking little through wondrous fat. Nor brighter were his eyes, nor moister than a too long opened oyster, save when at noon his paunch grew mutinous for a plate of turtle green and glutinous. Only a scraping of shoes on a mat, anything like the sound of a rat makes my heart go pit-a-pat. Come in, cried the mayor, looking bigger, and in did come the strangest figure. His long clear coat from heel to head was half yellow and half red, and he himself was tall and thin, with sharp blue eyes, each like a pin, and light loose hair and swarthy skin, nor tuft of hair on cheek, nor beard on chin, but lips where smile went out and in. There was no guessing his kith or kin, and nobody could enough admire this tall man in his quaint attire. Quoth one, it's as my great-grandsire, starting up at the trump of doom's tone, had walked this way from his painted tombstone. He advanced towards the council table, and please, your honor, said he, I am able, by means of secret charm, to draw all the creatures living beneath the sun, that crawl or swim or fly or run, after me so as you never saw. And I chiefly use my charm on creatures that do people harm, the mole and toad and newt and viper, and people call me the Pied Piper. And here they noticed round his neck a scarf of red and yellow stripe, to match with his coat of self-same check. In that scarf's end hung a pipe, and his fingers, they noticed, were ever straying, as if impatient to be playing upon this pipe, as though it dangled over his vesture so old-fangled. Yes, said he, Pied Piper as I am, in Tartary I bred the cam, last June from his huge swarms of gnats. I eased in Asia the Nizam, of a monstrous brood of vampire bats. And as for what your brain bewilders, if I rid your town of rats, will you give me 1,000 guilders? 50,000 was the exclamation of an astonished mayor and corporation. Into the street the piper stepped, smiling first a little smile, as if he knew what magic slept in his quiet pipe the while. Like a musical adept, to blow his pipe his lips he wrinkled, and green and blue his sharp eyes twinkled, like a candle flame where salt is sprinkled. And ere 3 shrill notes the pipe uttered, you heard as if an army muttered, and a muttering grew to a grumbling, and a grumbling grew to a mighty rumbling, and out of the houses came the rats tumbling, great rats, small rats, lean rats, brawny rats, brown rats, black rats, gray rats, tawny rats, brave old potters, gay young friskers, fathers, mothers, uncles, cousins, cocking tails and pricking whiskers, families by tens and dozens, brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, followed the Pied Piper for their lives. From street to street he piped advancing, and step for step they followed advancing, until they came to the river Wesser, where it all plunged and perished, save one who, stout as Julius Caesar, swam across and lived to carry, as he the manuscript he cherished, to land home his commentary, which was, at first shrill notes of the pipe, I heard a sound as of scraping tripe, and putting apples wondrous ripe into the cider presses bright, and moving away a pickle cupboard, and leaving a jar of conserve cupboards, and drawing the corks of train oil flasks, and breaking the hoops of butter casks. And it seemed as if a voice sweeter far than by harp or by psaltery is breathed, called out, "Oh, rats, rejoice! The world has grown to a vast dry saltery. So munch on, crunch on, take your nunch on, breakfast, supper, dinner, lunch on, and just the bulky sugar punch on, already stayed like a great sun shone, gracious scarce an inch before me, just as methought it said come for me, I found the Wesser rolling over me. You should have heard the Hamlin people ring the bells till they rock the steeple. Go, cried the merry long poles, poke out the nests and block up the holes, consult with carpenters and builders, and leave in our town not even a trace of the rats, when suddenly up the place the piper perked in the marketplace. The first, if you please, my 1,000 guilders. 1,000 guilders, the mayor looked blue, so did the corporation too. For council dinners made rare havoc, with claret, moselle, vin de gras, hock, and half the money would replenish their cellar's biggest pot of Rhenish, to pay this sum to a wondering fellow, with gypsy coat of red and yellow. Besides, quoth the mayor, the knowing wink, our business was done at the river's brink. We saw with our eyes the merchant sink, and what's dead can't come to life, I think. So, friend, we are not folks to shrink from our duty of giving you something to drink. and a matter of money he puts in the coat. But as for the guilders, what we spoke of them, as you well know, was in joke. Besides, our losses have made us thrifty. 1,000 guilders, come, take 50. Piper's face fell and he cried, no trifling, I can't wait beside. I promised to visit by dinner time Baghdad, and accept the crime with the head cook's pottage. All he's rich in, for having left in the caliph's kitchen, of a nest of scorpions no survivor. With him I prove no bargain driver, with you don't think I'll bait the stiver. And folks who put me in a passion, may find me pipe after another fashion. How, cried the mayor, do you think I brook, being worse treated than a cook? Insulted by a rival, with idle pipe and vicious piebald. Threaten us, fellow, do your worst, blow your pipe there till you burst. Once more the piper stepped into the street, and he laid his long pipe a smooth straight cane. And ere he blew 3 notes, such sweet soft notes as yet musicians cunning never gave the enraptured air. There was a rustling that seemed like a bustling of merry crowds justling, a pitching and hustling. Small feet were pattering, wooden shoes clattering, little hands clapping, and little tongues chattering. And like foals in a farmyard where barley is scattering, out came the children running, all the little boys and girls, with rosy cheeks of flax and curls, sparkling eyes and teeth like pearls, tripping and skipping right merrily after, the wonderful music with shouting and laughter. The mayor was dumb and the council stood, as if they were changed into blocks of wood, left behind against, unable to move a step or cry, so the children merrily skipping by could only follow with an eye that joyous crowd at the piper's back, and how the mayor was on the rack, and the wretched council's bosom feet, as the piper turned from the high school to where the Weser rolled its waters, right in the way of their sons and daughters. However, he turned from south to west, and to Koppelberg Hill his steps addressed, and after him the children pressed, great was the joy in every breast. He never can cross the mighty top, he's forced to let the piping drop, and we shall see our children stop. When lo, they reached the mountainside, a wondrous portal opened wide, as if a cavern was suddenly hollowed. The piper advanced and the children followed, and when all were into the very last, the door in the mountainside shut fast. Did I say, oh no, one was lame, and could not dance the whole of the way. And in after years, if you would blame his sadness, he was used to say, it is dull in our town since my playmates left. I can't forget that I'm bereft of all the pleasant sights they see, which the piper also promised me. For he led us, he said, to a joyous land, joining the town just at hand, where waters gushed and fruit trees grew, and flowers put forth a fairer hue, and everything was strange and new. The sparrow was brighter than the peacock here, and their dogs outran our fallow deer, and honeybees had lost their stings, and horses were born with eagle's wings. And just as I became assured, my lame foot would be speedily cured, the music stopped, and I stood still, and found myself outside the hill, and left behind against my will, to go now limping as before, and never hear of that country more. Alas, alas, for Hamelin, there came to many a burgher's pate, a text which says at heaven's gate, opes the rich at his easy rate, as the needle's eye takes a camel in. The mayor sent east, west, north, and south, to offer the piper by word of mouth, wherever it was men's lot to find him, silver and gold to his heart's content, if only he returned the way he went, and bring the children behind him. But when he saw it was lost endeavor, and piper and dancers were gone forever, they made a decree that lawyers never should think their records dated duly, if after the day of the month and year, these words do not as well appear. And so long after what happened here, on the 22nd of July, 1376, and the better memory to fix, the place of the children's last retreat, they called it the Pied Piper Street, where anyone playing pipe or tabor was sure for his future to lose his labor. Nor suffered they hospitality or tavern to shock with mirth the street so solemn. And opposite the place of the cavern, they wrote the story on a column, and on a great church window painted, the same to make the world acquainted, how their children were stolen away, and there it stands this very day. So I'm going to start with just giving you sort of a summary of the concrete narrative. and then we'll try to get into the abstract argument. So the story begins in Hamelin, the town of Hamelin, which is near famous Hanover City in Brunswick, province of Brunswick. Hamelin towns in Brunswick. Why famous Hanover City? The River Weser. Obviously, the River Weser is a very important feature that must be mentioned, and it is mentioned in the first stanza of the poem. Hamelin towns in Brunswick, by famous Hanover City. The River Weser deep and wide. The River Weser deep and wide. I've said in earlier streams that I really admire Robert Browning's use of parallel structure in this poem. And I think in that sentence right there, you get a good example of a really nice parallel structure, which is, the use of deep and wide. He's always using language that mirrors itself later in the poem. So just be aware of that as I analyze the poem, that there's very nice balancing of ideas and concepts throughout the poem. It's a very binary poem. There's a lot of opposition. Everything in the poem has its opposite. The River Weser, deep and wide, washes its wall on the southern side. That's something else that comes up in the poem as well. There's directionality introduced. There's orientation. So the first stanza is there just to orientate the reader, to just like introduce this town of Hamelin and put it into a context of a larger nation. So Hamelin towns in Brunswick, by famous Hanover City, the River Weser deep and wide washes its wall on the southern side. A pleasanter spot you never spied. But when begins my ditty, almost 500 years ago, to see my townsfolk suffer so from vermin was a pity. We see in that very first stanza, we see the first half of the stanza is describing a very pastoral scene. But right to the very right near the half point of that stanza, there's a fall. It goes from, introducing a beautiful city, a beautiful town next to a famous city that's on the riverbanks of a river that's deep and wide, that's in a countryside that is pleasant to behold. Right in that very first stanza, we go from an idyllic scene to a fall. We go from a bucolic, pastoral image to a scenario of horror. Hamlin towns in Brunswick, my famous Hanover city, the river Weser deep and wide washes its wall on the south and side. A pleasanter spot you never spied, but when begins my ditty almost 500 years ago. To see the townsfolk suffer so from vermin was a pity. We also learn that the narrator of the poem is telling the story 500 years after the fact. So we have to try to understand that this narrator is perhaps not very reliable. Hamlin towns in Brunswick, my famous Hanover city, the river Weser deep and wide washes its wall on the southern side. A pleasanter spot you never spied, but when begins my ditty, almost 500 years ago. To see the townsfolk suffer so from vermin was a pity. So we're getting a narrative that has been passed down over centuries. As a reader, we might doubt this person's reliability. We might doubt the factuality of the story. The narrator is definitely telling us a story of legendary stature. A story that we can either take for sooth or for fiction. In the next stanza, we learn about the actual nature of the catastrophe. And we're hit hard with that fact. We're hit hard with what the catastrophe is. So in the next stanza, we are immediately and violently introduced to the catastrophe that has befallen this town. And it is rats. Rats, they fought the dogs and killed the cats, and bit the babies in the cradles, and ate the cheeses from the vats, and licked the soup from the cook's own ladles, split open the kegs and salted sprats, made nests in many Sunday hats, and even spoiled the women's chats, while drowning out their speaking, with shrieking and squeaking, 50 different sharps and flats. This stanza is really brilliant stanza. In my mind, it really, the language of the poem really mimics behavior of a rat. It just sort of lists, it's a sort of a list of all the catastrophic destruction that the rats are causing to the town, and all the inconvenience and harm that it causes to their community, their children, their dogs, their cats. They consume their food, their from fats. It consumes their. They consume cheese, salted scraps. So, I mean, that's a pretty straightforward stanza, but like, we have to understand that the concrete narrative is imagining something else. The concrete narrative is there. There's a subtext. So in the next stanza, in the third stanza, we're introduced to some major characters in the poem. We're introduced to the mayor and the council and the people of Hamlin. And we learn about the people's dissatisfaction with the performance of the mayor and the council, and their increasing hostility and frustration that they are feeling because their livelihoods and their lives are being disturbed. So in the third stanza, it describes the townspeople arriving at some kind of assembly or they flock as one, as a mob, as an angry mob. They confront the mayor and the council. At last the people in a body to the town hall came flocking. "'Tis clear," cried they, "our mayor is a naughty." So there we see one, the people have developed some kind of solidarity and are now confronting the council and mayor. It's interesting to keep in mind the difference between Plato's Republic and the governance that we find in the Pied Piper of Hamelin. For instance, well, we know Plato's Republic, Plato imagined that it would be ruled by a philosopher king, that a well-informed community leader that makes decisions based on evidence and reason. That was the kind of leader that Plato imagined would be the leader of his utopic republic. So the government of Hamelin town is not, you know, at the level of Plato's Republic, obviously. It definitely isn't a meritocracy. It's somewhat of a democracy. It's, you know, like the people need to respond. Like the mayor needs to respond to populace, to anger. So what is being shown here is a democracy. Where a constituency makes a demand, and then their representative leaders take action. So it's not really what Plato would have envisioned as being his ideal republic. I think this might give us a clue to what the actual purpose of Robert Browning's argument is. Something I'll come back to anyways. At last the people came in a body to the town hall came flocking. "'Tis clear," cried they, "our mayor is a naughty, and as for our corporation, shocking. To think we buy gowns lined with ermine, for dolts who can't or won't determine what's best to rid us of our vermin. You hope because you're old and obese, to find in the furry civic robes ease. Rouse up, sirs, give your brains a racking, to find the remedy we are lacking, or sure as fate will send you packing." At this, the mayor and corporation quaked with a mighty consternation. So in that stanza, we get a fairly detailed description of the fact that the mayor and the council are elected by the people, that they're that their power and their prestige in the community is something that the community gives them. The people are just reminding the mayor and the council that their authority and legitimacy are based on the people's consensus. I think it's really good to contrast the mayor and the Pied Piper, because especially if we're going to try to make the abstract, like try to sort of flesh out this abstract argument that I believe is sort of the grounds for the narrative. Fourth stanza, we get another image, or another image of the mayor, a further description of the mayor that further portrays his ineptitude and At length the mayor broke silence, for Gilder eyed my ermine gown sell. I wish I were a mile hence. It's easy to bid one rack one's brain. I'm sure my forehead aches again. I scratch it so, but all in vain. Oh, for a trap, a trap, a trap. that first part of that stanza really sort of shows. We'll discover later how much of a lie that actually is. We discover that later in the poem we discover that the mayor hasn't really put any effort into remedying the situation of the rats. In fact, he's generally just been partying with his council buddies. So if we were going to compare Hamlin Town with Plato's Republic, we could say that it's not that the governance of Hamlin Town is not the governance that Plato had in mind for the Republic. So we could probably, I think that'll become fairly important to understand as we examine I think that art has a different place in a democracy than it does have in Plato's Republic. Art is something that must exist in a democracy, whereas in Plato's Republic it perhaps is not as necessary because I'm just sort of, yeah. Anyways, let's go on. At length the mayor broke silence, for a gilder eyed my urban gownsel. I wish I were a mile hence. You see there that the mayor he doesn't take his responsibility as the leader of Hamlin Town very seriously. He'd rather avoid this situation completely. He would sell the robes that represent his authority and the legitimacy of his position in society is represented by those robes, but he would sell those robes in a second if he was able to avoid having to deal with the catastrophic harm that the rats are causing. At length the mayor broke silence, for a gilder eyed my ermine gownsel. I wish I were a mile hence. It's easy to bid one rack one's brain. I'm sure my poor head aches again. There he's even insulting the townspeople. He's saying that it's easy for you to demand action from your government. Which is, a lot of problems in society are difficult, right? Like, a lot of things government just is not going to be able to solve for people. So I think that there's some balance in the criticism here. We like the mayor and the council are obviously really quite inept in their appointed station, you know, in their appointed jobs. They're quite inept at their jobs. But I think there's some. I think there's also some ambivalence in the language that's used to describe the people as well. You know, they act in a body. They shout. You know, they're their expectation of the mayor is actually quite extreme, quite maybe they expect too much of their mayor. You know, a plague of rats is not an easy thing to deal with. I'm sure. At length the mayor broke silence, for a gilder eyed my ermine gown cell. I wish I were a mile hence. Ermine, if you're wondering, is just a really fine, I'm not exactly sure what material it is made out of, but ermine would have been a very fine fabric. Ermine. For a gilder eyed by ermine gown south, I wish I were a mile hence. It's easy to bid one rack one's brain. I'm sure my poor head aches again. I scratch it so, but all in vain. Oh, for a trap, a trap, a trap. Just as he said this, what should happen? At the chamber door, but a gentle tap. Bless us, cried the mayor, what's that? With the corporation as he sat, looking little through wondrous fact, nor brighter were his eyes, nor moister. There we get another really interesting description of the mayor. We've already learned that he's old and obese, that he's a naughty. You know, obviously the narrator has a fairly low opinion of the mayor. But we need to remember that the narrator is telling us the story 500 years after it happened. So. At length the mayor broke silence, for Gilder eyed my ermine gown cell. I wish I were a mile hence. It's easy to bid one rack one's brain. I'm sure my poor head aches again. I scratch it so, but all in vain. Oh, for a trap, a trap, a trap. Just as he said this, what should hap at the chamber door but a gentle tap? Bless us, cried the mayor, what's that? With the corporation as he sat, looking little through wonder as fat, nor brighter were his eyes, nor moister than a too long opened oyster, save when at noon his paunch grew mutinous, or plate of turtle greed and glutinous. Only the scraping of shoes on mat, anything like the sound of a rat makes my heart go pit-a-pat. So in that stanza, we just learn more about the mayor's, more about his character. You know, in his appearance, he's old, obese. He has moist eyes that are like oysters. Like the mayor broke silence for a gilded eyed by Irving Gounsell. I wish I were a mile hence. It's easy to bid one rack one's brain. I'm sure my poor head aches again. I scratch a toe, but all in vain. Oh, for a trap, a trap, a trap. Just as he said this, what should hap at the chamber door but a gentle tap? Bless us, cried the mayor, what's that? With the corporation as he sat, looking little through wonder as fat, nor brighter were his eyes, nor moister than a too long opened oyster. Save when at noon his paunch grew mutinous, for a plate of turtle green and glutinous, only a scraping of shoes on a mat, anything like the sound of a rat makes my heart go pit-a-pat. That line is interesting. He's the only time he has any life in his eyes is when he's looking at food. It's obvious that the narrator has no affection for the mayor. So the next stanza, we are finally introduced to the mayor, to the Pied Piper. Come in, cried the mayor, looking, and we discover that he is quite a different individual than any of the characters that we have been introduced to so far. His clothing is unusual. It's brightly colored, multicolored. It's pied. I said in earlier, I've defined the word pied before in earlier streams, and it means multicolored. So obviously. He's tall, he has swarthy skin, young, healthy skin. He has blue eyes, each like a pin. So he's quite the contrast to the mayor. He's exceptionally tall and marvelously adorned with colorful clothing. He has a flute. Well, they call it a pipe, obviously. He has a pipe attached to a belt. So in this stanza, the mayor invites the Pied Piper enter. So he says, "Come in," cried the mayor, looking bigger, and in did come the strangest figure. His long queer coat from heel to head was half yellow and half red, and he himself was tall and thin, with sharp blue eyes, each like a pin. And light loose hair its swarthy skin, nor tuft of hair on cheek, nor beard on chin, but lips where smile went out and in. There was no guessing his kith or kin, and nobody could enough admire this tall man in his quaint attire. Quoth one, "It's as my great-grandsire, starting up at the trump of doom's tone, had walked this way from his painted tombstone." So I think that the last three sentences of that, or the last three lines of that stanza, we also get the image of the Pied Piper as some kind of ancestral figure. He's as a grandsire at the trump of doom's tone had walked this way from his painted tombstone. So it's as though he's an ancestor that's risen from the dead. In the next stanza, we hear the Pied Piper speak for the first time. So he advances towards the council table. "Please, your honor," said he, "I am able, by means of secret charm, to draw all the creatures living beneath the sun, that crawl or swim or fly or run, after me so as you never saw. And I chiefly use my charm on creatures that do people harm, the mole and toad and newt and viper, and people call me the Pied Piper. And here they notice round his neck a scarf of red and yellow stripe, to match with his coat of self-same check. And at scarf's end hung a pipe, and his fingers they noticed were ever straying, as if impatient to be playing upon this pipe, as low it dangled over his vesture so old-fangled. Yes," said he, "Pied Piper as I am, in Tartary I fred the cam, last June from his huge swarms of gnats. I eased in Asia the Nizam of a monstrous brood of vampire bats. And as for what your brain bewilders, if I rid your town of rats, will you give me 1,000 guilders?" So the contrast couldn't be any more apparent between the mayor. The contrast couldn't be any more stark. So we have the mayor on one hand is old, obese, incompetent, blusterous, boastful. ignorant, and highly self-absorbed. Whereas the Pied Piper, on the other hand, is lively. His hands are always moving towards his pipe. His fingers. We're often, itching to play his pipe, obviously. Advanced towards the count, say, "Well, please, Your Honor," said he, "I am able, by means of secret charm, to draw all the creatures living beneath the sun, that crawl or swim or fly or run after me so as you never saw. And I chiefly use my charm on creatures that do people harm, the mole and toad and newt and viper, and people call me the Pied Piper." And here they notice round his neck a scarf of red and yellow stripe to match with his coat self-same check. And that scarf stand hung a pipe. And his fingers, they noticed, were ever straying. His fingers were ever straying, as if impatient to be playing upon this pipe. So I'm going to shut it down today.